Welcome, including those joining online. My name is Hazm Zohani. I'm a research fellow at the Oxford Uehiro Center for Practical Ethics, and I'll be chairing this term's second Cinquas Special Ethics Seminar, which is co-hosted by the Uehiro Center and the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities. Before I introduce our speaker, very quick bit of housekeeping, which is to say that this is being recorded for podcasting purposes, and it just makes everything easier to stick to a traditional format and keep questions to the end. Otherwise, we need people to sign consent forms or edit them out later, which complicates things. So it'll be easier just to keep questions to the end. Okay, on to our speaker. We are very fortunate today to have Professor Mark Kugelberg speak to us about AI's impact on our ability to control our beliefs and what that means for democracy. Mark is Professor of Philosophy of Media and Technology at the University of Vienna, and he's visiting us at the Uehiro Center till the end of the month. He'll speak for approximately 45 minutes, leaving plenty of time for discussion, after which we have some drinks waiting for us outside in the common area. Please.
Thank you very much to introduce me. It's a pleasure to be here, both at Uehiro Center, where I'm invited, as well as here in St. Cross. And I'm looking forward to your questions and to see what you're interested in this topic. I started off with this question: is AI bad for democracy? And I use various entries to answering this question and also to clarify it. What I'll do today is to focus on this concept of epistemic agency. I thought this is one way this topic can be approached. So it works good. So the context of this is that concerns about AI and democracy, which also relates to general context in which there is a tendency towards authoritarianism, even in countries that pretend to be democracies. And in that context, and there's this new technology, and then the question is, what is it going to do? Is it going to have an impact on that? And if so, how? And then, as a philosopher, I want to conceptualize that. I want to understand it by using concepts, and I want to make arguments about it. So that's what I'm doing. I started more with ethics of AI, but at the moment I'm very interested in using political philosophy to do that. This particular talk connects to epistemology and of course moral philosophy, that's a little bit also a kind of context for this talk. So the question is AI bad for democracy? Of course, has to start with this concept of AI. What is AI? There are various forms of AI. Today, the AI that's very popular usually refers to machine learning, use of machine learning with big data. The computer helps us to find patterns in this data. It's basically a kind of statistics machine. Instead of appearing as something that only does calculations, suddenly these technologies engage, for example, with language, use language, one could say, the famous examples of ChatGPT and similar, but also can be used for all kind of political purposes, for example, for analyzing data of social media users, and then this can be politically used. Democracy is the other concept, and that's maybe at least as vague if you don't say more about it. What I do for the purpose of this paper and talk is to just make a distinction between thin versions of democracy, which are all about voting. Voting when you have a system, a representational system with voting, then according to those conceptions of democracy, you have a democracy. You're fine. I personally sympathize with thicker, richer conceptions of democracy, but then it gets tricky. But I find it very interesting. So, for example, Dewey, Habermas, this kind of direction thinks that deliberation, discussion is important in a democracy, not just voting. You need to actively engage as citizens. Chantal Mouffe comes from my country, Belgium. It has an agnostic conception, which is more about struggle and having your voice heard. These are all conceptions, I think, that is really not just about voting, but that is a lot about language, also about discussion, which can be rational, less rational, can be emotional also. But it's, you know, what they have in common, these notions, is that the citizens are supposed to engage. They don't only get something, they also have to do something. They have to actively somehow engage in their political community by at least discussing these common questions. Another way to talk about this is to talk about political agency, because if citizens are allowed to do that, can do that, are encouraged to do that, that means that, yeah, one can say that as yeah, I'm allowed to freely vote. That's a kind of political agency, but in this richer conceptions, political agency means much more. It means that you're, you know, being allowed and being able to reason, to discuss, to defend your view, for example, something that's normal for philosophers, but it's not that common in political systems that we have, that all citizens do these things. And then, yeah, being able to make your voice heard, for example, is also another way, another form of political agency. So it all depends on what you mean by democracy. What I'm very interested in for this talk is the conditions for democracy, the question, what is needed as conditions in order to get all these forms of agency and democracy going. And yeah, partly that can be about principles such as freedom. If you don't have some basic freedoms, you're in an authoritarian system, perhaps totalitarian system, then that's not a, you know, the conditions for democracy are not fulfilled. So you cannot even talk about, let's have a rational discussion, for example, because you're in prison or you risk to be imprisoned, for example. In Hannah Arendt, there is also an interesting link to the social. What kind of social, you know, environment do we need in a society to have democracy? And she makes a connection with loneliness and the opposite of that. So that's interesting. And then what is relevant for this talk is knowledge, and therefore also education. What kind of knowledge do citizens need to exercise those forms of political democratic agency? That I'm interested in. And then, yeah, we need to look at ways how to talk about that knowledge. And one way to do that, just one way, that there's many possibilities here. One way is to use the concept of epistemic agency, which I found in social epistemology. And yeah, I found it an interesting concept, because then it would allow me to make it more specific, like, okay, what exactly could be wrong with political agency then, when we look at the conditions for knowledge, and what would be, you know, could AI be bad in some sense, and what does it mean? So all my questions that I ask can now be asked in a more specific way. But before I can ask these questions, I need to say something about epistemic agency. So in, you know, moral psychology, in practical philosophy, the idea is that agents want some control over their beliefs and have a certain degree, descriptively speaking, a certain degree of control over their beliefs. And one can then have discussions, for example, how voluntary is that formation of beliefs, and in particular in social epistemology, the question is, like, given that we live in a social environment, yeah, how how free and voluntary is the formation of beliefs, because we know, for example, from social psychology that our beliefs can be heavily influenced by our social environment. So what in that context means this kind of indeed epistemic agency then. What I do, being a philosopher of technology, I want to know, like, what about the technological environment, or one could say the techno-social environment. So what if we bring in AI there, for example, and see how that impacts the social environment, and does that change anything? What is it going to do to epistemic agency, and therefore to these conditions for democracy? So to make that connection more precise, one could say that some degree of epistemic agency is needed for political agency in a democracy, especially in the thick version, but even in the thin version. In a thin version, it means like, yeah, I need some control over a degree of control over the formation of my beliefs, because why would voting make sense if I cannot form my own beliefs, right? So then if everything is known, we could just ask AI, for example, like, we could collect data about the beliefs that people have because they are manipulated, for example. So this is needed, but also in these versions where discussion is important for democracy, there is very important to have the capacity to detach myself from my beliefs, reflect on these beliefs, and also very important, willing to revise them. Because why having a discussion if everyone just says, like, this is what I believe, and that's the end of the matter. So the idea is that all this kind of richer versions of democracy, that you also learn something, that you are willing to, at least for the duration of the discussion, to spend holding on to those beliefs at all costs, and be willing to discuss them. Also the willingness to take responsibility for one's beliefs, willingness to voice them and stand for them. And then, the willingness to openly discuss the beliefs and revise them. I like to formulate that in terms of vulnerability. Do we render the beliefs vulnerable to reflection and deliberation? So then the question is, with AI, is the development and exercise of these forms of political epistemic agency, and hence the exercise of responsibility as citizens, possible under conditions shaped by the use of AI and other digital technologies, especially in the social media environments, or influenced by social media environments? So this is the question. And my answer is that since AI may influence belief formation in various ways, the exercise of forms of epistemic agency needed for political agency in a democracy becomes at least more difficult. So this constitutes a kind of risk for democracy. There's no determinism, because technological determinism would mean that you have a technology and you have an effect and there's nothing to do about it. This is not how technology works, and this is also not how politics in the social world works. But it is interesting to conceptualize the influence and the risk. So my conclusion will be that AI endangers democracy, especially the thick conceptions of it, and regardless of other ways that AI may endanger democracy. So let's go into how AI may influence the formation and revision of political beliefs, because that's then what's going on. How exactly are these beliefs influenced? And I distinguish between three ways they are influenced. One is a direct and intended one, the manipulation of beliefs by politicians and the people they employ. But there's also indirect and non-intended effects One that has to do with knowledge. I'm not so sure about that one. This is something that I also would really like to put vulnerable to discussion. And then the third one is this phenomenon of epistemic bubbles, echo chambers, and so on, which I think also impacts the epistemic agency of people and therefore the political agency. So these are the three parts of the paper. So in order to discuss that, I picked up a thought experiment from Bondi that's in the social epistemology literature, or at least in the literature on epistemic agency. So there's a person, Claire, raised in a racist community and comes to believe that people with white skin color are superior. And then the question is like, how can she, if she wants to change her belief, how can she change that belief? And in this case, towards like a non-racist one. The thought experiment from Bondi is all about social influence. You know, this person being in a social environment and therefore having difficulties to change the belief, being raised also in a certain environment. And I'm interested in, what about the technological influence? Will Claire be able to exercise her epistemic agency to change beliefs under the influence of AI? So first, manipulation of beliefs. Social media campaigns based on the analysis of data by means of AI and data science. This is not a thought experiment. It's very real. There was this Cambridge Analytica case. Happy that it wasn't called the Oxford Analytica case, but I will talk in Cambridge later this spring. So Cambridge Analytica was the case that Facebook users, they produce data by their behavior, and these data are then harvested, in that case without their consent, talking about consent forms, so without consent, and also then used for micro-targeting people to influence their voting behavior. So this is very clearly intended use of AI for the influencing the beliefs of people. So to take up Claire's example, she's, for example, targeted by a pro-Trump political advertising in order to, in that case, not have her change her beliefs, right? So to stick to her beliefs and vote for that political direction. So this case can be interpreted as a case of belief formation and revision by means of direct manipulation of beliefs. It's somewhat comparable to nudging in the sense that no one is coercing Claire, right? No one is forcing her to have a certain belief or to not revise her beliefs, but there is an influence under the radar, so to speak, an influence. So it's bypassing this capacity we have as rational autonomous beings, something that philosophers find particularly painful. So this is happening by means of this technology, by means of AI and data science. And that one could conceptualize that as saying that Claire's political and epistemic agency is reduced as she is manipulated to change her beliefs or not change her beliefs without her knowledge. So the manipulation, she doesn't know about that, and without her consent. And this clearly violates the requirements of democratic citizenship, the epistemic agency conditions for democratic citizenship. Then there's the second one. So here my worry is that through AI, we get a lot of statistical knowledge out there. Not always directly, but just through the results of AI. For example, if you use ChatGPT, it's all about the statistics of the occurrence of words, like if they occur together, that's counted. And so that gives a certain statistics, and on the basis of that, this program creates text. Now, this kind of mediation and yeah, bringing to the public sphere of all this statistical information is problematic in various ways. I think, first of all, because it's something that's not clear that's happening. It's something that, if you look into the phenomenon, if you study it, if you're very interested in it, you can find out how AI works. But many people use or will use technology without finding out all these things, so they don't even know, that this is based on statistical knowledge. But more importantly, for this particular worry I have is that people would not be encouraged to look at causal knowledge, which we get through the sciences. So in this case, for example, there might be statistical information about success in a certain society. It could be that, for example, in American society, that people of a certain skin color, white skin color, are more successful. Now that statistics then gets, through AI gets amplified. And my worry in terms of changing of beliefs is that this again renders epistemic agency, the exercise of that, more difficult, because the statistical knowledge is offered as default. And I'm worried that people would not be encouraged to look up causal knowledge, which would tell you that there is no causal relationship between skin color and success in a society. So this really, I think, makes it harder to change Claire's beliefs in the example, and it's a problem in a democracy if this statistical knowledge becomes more dominant in relation to the causal knowledge from the sciences. I'm not so sure about this point, but it's I'm looking forward to see what you think about it. The third point is also often a way of influencing people without intending so, because although some politicians might be interested that people stay in a certain bubble and just stay having the same beliefs, it also happens unintended. So what is the phenomenon? The phenomenon is that if you're engaging through social media, and in social media there is this AI is active to moderate, to also create this to analyze the patterns. And what happens there is that there's the danger that one always hears the same people, talks to the same people, and remains in what's called an epistemic bubble. In the literature, there's also the distinction epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. I'm not so interested in that here. For me, it's important here to see this as a problem of epistemic agency again. So if you exclude other voices, discredit other voices, and distrust other sources, then you indeed have this epistemic bubble, and you will be less likely, I think, to revise your beliefs and put them vulnerable to discussion, because you will always hear the same. For example, Claire hears always these white supremacist echoes and stays in her bubble. And so I think there's a problem not only for the diversity of views as such, but also because people are not encouraged to exercise their capacity for epistemic agency, which is problematic for these democratic conditions. So this diminishes citizens' capacity to render their beliefs vulnerable. It encourages rather people to feel confident, perhaps overconfident about their beliefs, and this reduces their political agency. Again, not necessarily intended, can be intended, but doesn't have to be. And yeah, AI contributes to that. by also moderating social media in such a way that you will see always more posts of the things that you like. You will see more opinions that you like, and so in the end, you're just having this cozy thing with your political friends, but you're insufficiently exposed to other views, and even in the end, don't trust them so much anymore. So those are three ways that AI may influence epistemic agency as relevant to democracy. And yeah, I think this was one way to ask the question concerning AI and democracy in a more specific way, namely what kind of epistemic agency is needed for democratic political agency, and do people have sufficient of that kind of agency, given that AI shapes that agency, with of course my normative interest to preserve democracy, and normative interest to then ask about the relation between AI and democracy. So the answer I've given here can be summarized as follows: supposing that some degree of and some forms of epistemic agency are needed for political agency in a democracy, in the sense that, at least according to the TIC ideal, in a democracy, I need to be able to freely form my beliefs, to reflect on my political beliefs, and to openly discuss these beliefs with others, if necessary, revise them, then the exercise of such forms of epistemic agency is to render more difficult, if not endangered, by AI-supported intended manipulation of political beliefs, unintended defaulting of statistical knowledge as opposed to causal knowledge, and third, usually unintended creation and maintenance of epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, which discourages rendering beliefs vulnerable to discussion and revision. So this is, of course, a kind of exploratory work, but I think it can be further developed. It can be developed, for example, by looking also at other but related issues that are formulated not in epistemic agency, but using another concept, but to also think about, like, how can democracy be undermined here, and perhaps also empirical research could for support these claims or diffuse some of these claims. And for example, with epistemic bubbles, there's also some research that shows that next to this polarization and bubbles, there's also a diversity of views on social media. And so this kind of research, as far as I see it, is not conclusive, but it's worth further engaging with that. So if this is the case, then to end with recommendations more towards the outside world is, well, if these dangers are identified and analyzed are real, then if we want to strengthen democracy, it's of course an if, there might be regimes and people who don't want that, but if we want to strengthen democracy, then we need to regulate AI, and so that these phenomena are occurring less, that there's less risk for these phenomena and therefore these influences. But also I think education when it comes to knowledge is of course really important. So we need to teach anyway for democracy people how to exercise their political agency and create the knowledge basis for that. And that means, I think, in this kind of social technological environment, when there's more pressure on belief revision and when it's more harder to exercise your political agency, I think in such environments, it is extra important to enable and encourage citizens to reflect on their beliefs, render them vulnerable in open and public forums. And yeah, I think this is not just an individual matter to enable to give individuals the skills, but also requires then an institutional reform, because currently our educational institutions are not necessarily geared at this. You have to be lucky or privileged to have that kind of education. So we need more of that kind of education, I think, for everyone, if we care about democracy. So in closing, I would like to quote one of my favorite political philosophers, John Dewey, who said that democracy is not just a form of government, but primarily a mode of associated living. And that is, of course, one of these richer ideals of democracy, right? It's not just about voting, but it's about community also, in his view. But of course, that raises a lot of questions about community, the role of community in modern society, and how this can be done in practice. But I think for this paper, this epistemic agency I've been talking about can also take the form of the types of agency that are necessary to make this kind of communicated experience stronger, and see this not only as a means for some abstract kind of democracy, but as a valuable thing on itself. Now, these are claims that stand apart from this paper, but I just want to end with that in order to also disclose the sort of more normative direction where I personally would like to go. However, I think the arguments in this paper are valid for all kinds of political agency and forms of democracy. So for technology, then, I think we need these political technologies, as I call them, that enable rather than hinder such forms of living, such experiences, and even without taking into account that of course that stimulate such forms of epistemic agency I've been talking about, rather than hindering, rather than risking to erode the conditions for the formation of such such knowledge and such epistemic agency skills. Thank you.